Hey everybody, this video is going to go over how to create an APA reference entry for most websites and webinars. So like and subscribe below to keep these videos coming. We're going to start on the APA styles page that goes over the basic elements that go into a reference entry. So for APA, it's divided into 4 elements: author, date, title, and then source. Source information is going to tell me as the reader or instructor where you found your source. So let's look at some common websites and webinars. We're going to start with the webinar. So for a webinar in the author space, these are your speakers, and they are listed just as an author would be. Last name, comma, and then first initial, and possibly a middle initial if that is given. If you have more than one speaker, you do the initials of the first person and then a comma, and then you do the same thing for the next speaker. So it'd be last name, comma, first initial. If you have a first and middle initial, it's first initial period space, middle initial period. Then you would put a comma and keep going. If you have multiples and you need to use the and, be sure to use shift 7, ampersand, and don't use the spelling out of the word and. After the last author, make sure that there's a period to mark the end of that element, and you move on to the date element. The date would be the year in parentheses, and then you would put a period after that. Now, if your webinar aired on a specific date, then you could use the whole specific date. So that would be year, comma, and the month spelled out, and then the day. After that, you would put a period to mark the end of the date element, and you move to the title element. The title of a webinar is in italics with sentence casing. So the first word is capitalized. Any proper nouns, so names of people and places, get capitalized. And you would capitalize the first word after punctuation like a colon, question mark, exclamation mark, or period that would be in that title. So you would capitalize that next word. Otherwise, none of the other content words are capitalized for an APA title. However, we need to note that this is not a typical source. This is a webinar, and so in brackets, you put the word webinar before you put the period to mark the end of the title element. So that's a little bit different. After that, you would put the host of the webinar. So for example, the American Psychological Association or whoever the host of the webinar was, then you would put a period and your link to that webinar. Dictionary definitions, I see these a lot. So first you put if you do not have an individual author here, you would use what I would call the corporate author. So who is hosting this dictionary? For example, if you're pulling a definition from the American Psychological Association, they hold the author space. If this is coming from Merriam-Webster, then Merriam-Webster is the author space. And put a period at the end of that author's name. Next thing, most dictionary definitions do not have dates. If they give you a date, that's great, put the date in there, but most of them are not going to give you a date, but you can't skip a date element. APA says no, no, no to skipping dates. So if you don't have a date, you put parentheses and in it, N period, D period. That stands for no date. So N period, D period. It's also lowercase, not capital letters. That's in parentheses, and then you put a period to mark the end of the date element. The next thing is the word that you are using, the word you looked up. So for example, internet addiction or existential, those are not in italics, and they have just the regular sentence casing for titles. Period goes at the end of that to mark the end of the title element. The next thing is you need to put in what dictionary you got it from. So you put in and then the dictionary name. That dictionary name gets italics. So for example, in APA Dictionary of Psychology, that gets italics, and then you'd put a period there. Or in Merriam-Webster.com dictionary, that gets italics, and then you put a period. Now, these are subject to change, so you would want to put a retrieval date in there. So you put retrieved, the date that you found it, month, spell out the month, the day, comma, the year, comma, then you put from, and then the link to that definition. Definitions tend to change with frequency, and so that's why it's important to put that retrieval date in there. And then after the link, you're done. Don't put periods after links. For podcasts, so first you put the host of the podcast. They hold the author space, and it's same last name, comma, first initial, and possibly middle initial periods. However, in parentheses there, you need to note that that is a host as opposed to an author spot. So you put host in parentheses and then the period to mark the end of the author space. Next, you move on to the date space. If you've got a date, that's great. Put it in there. It would be year, comma, month, day. If it does not have a date, then you would put N period, D period to note no date. Then put a period to mark the end of that. Actually, that doesn't even have that in there. That should be there. I pulled these from APA. There. Then the next thing is the title of the podcast. This does not get italics, so it's just the regular title and sentence casing, so only the first word and proper nouns capitalized. Then you need to put what number podcast this was. So in parentheses, you put NO period for number and then whatever number it was. So number 4, 3, 2, 1, whatever. Then you need to identify what this was. You need to identify the fact that it was an audio podcast episode. So in brackets, that would be the square parentheses. They're up on the keyboard by the P. Use those and identify it as audio podcast episode. That's what you put in brackets. And then after that, you put your period to mark the end of the title space or the title element. Then you move on to the publication, the source space, source element. You would put in and then the name of the podcast. So what's the name of the podcast? That gets italicized. So in the Happiness Lab with Dr. Lori Santos, for example. That is in italics, and then you put a period. Then the publisher or host of that, for example, Pushkin Industries, and then your link goes at the end. Okay, so that would be for a podcast. Now we get into web pages. So the first one I want to cover is websites that come from a news website. So I see these a lot. So authors come first. You do the author's last names, then the full date. So this should be the year, month, day that this information was published, in parentheses with a period after it. Then the title of the article on the news website. This is in italics, and put a period at the end of the title. Then is the name of the news website. So if you got this from CNN or Fox News or ABC News or Vox or something like that, you put that and then a period at the end of that. After that, you would put the link to know where you got that particular news article. If you are citing a web page with information that changes frequently, like dictionary definitions, you would want to use retrieved from and dates. So this example is a COVID dashboard from Johns Hopkins. And so because those dashboards tend to change information as new numbers and new data comes in, we need to include that retrieved date to tell me as the instructor, hey, if you want to see the same thing that I found on this date, like May 6th, 2020, I would need to go to their archives to find the data that you were looking at that time. Okay. So again, you would use either the author space, and if there's not an author, then you would give the group name. So this would be, for example, the Center for Systems Science and Engineering is the group that produced this particular data set. Period marks the end of the author space, the author element. Date element, again in parentheses, year, comma, spell out the month and day. Put a period to mark the end of the date element. Move on to the title. Actually, that should be in italics too. Sometimes when you copy and paste, not all of the italics comes through. So we'll do that. So the title is in italics, again with title or with sentence casing. So COVID is capitalized because that's how they did it, and it's the first word. Centers for Systems, Science, and Engineering is capitalized because it's the name. It's a proper noun. It's a name for a group. Same thing with Johns Hopkins University. It is the name of a university, so it is a proper noun. So those things get capitalized. Then the host of the information, which is Johns Hopkins University in Medicine, the Coronavirus Resource Center. So that is who hosted that particular information that was produced by the Centers for Systems, Science, and Engineering. Now you need to put when you got this because it may change by the time I, as the reader or instructor, go in to look at it. So you put retrieved and then the date. Spell out the month, day, comma, year, comma. Then the word from, and then your link. Okay. Next thing are pages that don't require retrieval date. So these are things that are not likely to change with frequency. And again, you use the author as the last name, comma, first initial. If you have a first and a middle initial, it's first initial period space, middle initial period. That final period with the initials marks off the author element. The date goes in parentheses. If you have the full date, you write the full date. So year, comma, spell out the month, day. If you only have a year, you use that. If you do not have a date at all, you use N period, D period. But you don't get to skip the date part. Put a period to mark the end of the date element, move on to the title. Most of the time, the title of the website is what gets italics, and then the host of the website would come after that. This is an example of how stuff works is not capitalized online, and so it's not capitalized here. And then after your publisher or host would be your links. So if you had, this is a good example, this one from the World Health Organization. This one had an identified author, so it's holding the author space. However, if it did not identify an author, we would take World Health Organization and move it to the author spot. And that would take the place as the corporate author. But once we move it from the host or publisher to the author space, we don't double up and put it again in that host or publisher space. You only get to list them once. Author or host publisher, but not both. Titles again get the title sentence casing, so proper nouns, words after special punctuation, and first words. That's it. Hosts and publishers go after if it is not in the author space. This is a good example of when the host of the information is in the author space. So the International Society for Technology and Education is considered the author because there wasn't an individual person identified. ND, N period, D period for no date, title in italics, link at the end. This is a person who was not identified by their name, but by their username. And so instead of doing last name, comma, first initial, we have to use the username space here. So this would be Josh _ Luderbach as the username, and that takes the author space. Period, N period, D period for your date, the title, and this is from Quizlet. So if you needed to cite a set of Quizlet flashcards, this is how you would do from Quizlet. So the title of the flashcard set is in italics, Quizlet as the host, and then the link would go at the end, and that actually should be a live link. There we go. So that is how to build reference entries for some pretty common online sources that you might be using in your essay. So I hope this helps. Good luck with your project and have a great day.